Hello, and welcome to our first recorded lecture. As promised, I'm going to try to give you kind of a sample for how I teach and how I do things so you can kind of decide whether or not you want to keep in the course. But, this is a topic near and dear to me. My PhD is focusing on 19th century medicine and how the Civil War became the fulcrum to professionalization and changing how we view medicine. So I wanted to start here because I think A, it's something I'm very comfortable teaching, but B, I think it's interesting and a little bit outside the mainstream. Our course starts at a weird location, as we talked about a little bit already, but it starts after the Civil War. I find a lot of problems with this because our Civil War is probably the most important moment in our history. And I know you might be thinking our founding, but the Civil War changes who we are. Because it tests the Constitution, and in the end the Constitution, of course, wins out. But we'll be getting more to that when we talk about Reconstruction. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the medicine and the illness of the Civil War. So I want to start here with a picture. This comes from the movie Gettysburg, and you can tell it's Gettysburg because of the kind of beautiful uniforms and the fact that Ted Turner is right here. He was an executive producer and likes to write himself into all of his movies. But when we look at this uniforms and this picture, we see a few problems. Okay, first, everyone is wearing clean, sparkly blue uniforms, and other than the glorious facial hair, a lot of the hygiene is a problem, right? For those of you who don't know, Robert E. Lee invades Pennsylvania in an attempt to speed up, rather, the end of the war. And the end of the war, in this context, is the seizure of Washington, D.C. In Napoleonic-style combat. Taking the capital city meant you controlled the territory. However, Gettysburg was obviously not Washington, D.C., so why did he go to Gettysburg? Well, the Confederate Army had been so understaffed and underprepared that Gettysburg was a prime target because they had a shoe factory. The Confederate troops had not had fresh boots in years. Weapons had to last twice as long if you were Confederate. They were not getting fresh supplies. And Robert E. Lee, in his kind of blunder, his famous mistake battle, the bloodiest battle in American history, was just trying to get food and supplies and boots for his men. A slightly more accurate picture is this one. The picture here is of a mass being performed by a Roman Catholic chaplain to Union troops. You see the people in their dress blues, but you already can see that, again, this is their dress blues. You can see kind of a child here, the drummer boy. And his uniform as the pastor, the chaplain, is clean. But this is because, of course, he was given extra soap rations to make sure his vestments were cleared. For the most part, these men, of course, cleaned up a little bit for church, but they were, you can see, kind of haggard, ragged. But mostly, this is the image we're used to. And to put this into context, right, this isn't just what a soldier would come across, right? This is the end of Chancellorsville, an early battle that takes place in an urban setting. This is a Brady print, and for those of you who know a little bit about the Civil War, Matthew Brady was a very important photographer of the war, and you can see the corpses strewn about, laying all over. This matters because, yes, it is traditional for people to bury the dead. The army that is usually won the field is responsible, though this becomes problems later, like, the Confederates don't often bury Union dead, and when the war ends, they refuse to relinquish corpses, even in their own Marietta Cemetery down the way. But, the rotting dead becomes a problem. If you're a small southern farmer and you are tilling the fields after the war, you'll often find bodies or unexploded ordnances, and they end up in the water supply, and it's awful. But it's not just this illness. It's not just the dead, rather. It's also the illnesses that kind of leave a lasting impact. The average soldier, these numbers come from a very important document that catalogs every illness registered by any surgeon or commanding officer in the war. Only on the Union side, though. The Confederates don't keep very good records, and though there are individual generals or individual armies or surgeons that do a good job, for the most part, the Confederates have no central statistical organization. So this is kind of intriguing if you guys look through it. This lists all the major diseases that are captured that affect the Union troops. At the top, of course, you see diarrhea and dysentery, which is a bacterial infection which causes you to poop yourself to death. As you can see, 44,000 some odd U.S. soldiers died by pooping themselves to death. Cholera is very similar, but it kills you in less than 24 hours. And you can see it's extremely deadly to 305 of them. But down the line, malaria we'll get back to, bronchitis. It's amazing how many things you can think of that, bronchitis. I've got a sinus infection before, but that's didn't kill me. Also, these cases, quote-unquote cases, are when people are too sick to fight. So we're talking thousands and thousands and thousands of these things. 17 million cases of diarrhea or dysentery that's so bad that a soldier can't fight is a lot, considering that this war really only lasts about 4 years. Gonorrhea, STDs, right? Anyone know what conjunctivitis is? Now, I know when I say this, I'm recording it, so I'm going to give you a second. Conjunctivitis? That's right, pink eye. If you ever had pink eye or been around young kids who seem to always be rubbing themselves, 4 people died of it, conjunctivitis. I don't know if their eye just explodes out of their face or what, but and then down the line, right? Pneumonia, 77,000 some odd people. Didn't kill Hillary Clinton, but it did kill 20,000. Jaundice is liver damage, right? You turn yellow. Measles, we'll get back to. And then just a few more along the line here. Tonsillitis, tonsils removed, right? An abscess, ew. TB, smallpox, killed millions of natives, and even here, 7,000 soldiers. Down the line. Did you get your meningitis shot? Because it killed 2,600 others. And you can see 20 million cases, right? Killing 140,000. This is before, and you notice gangrene wasn't there. This is before they set foot on the battlefield, they died. Here are some non-contagious diseases, non-transmittable ones at least. Rheumatism, we'll get to that, because rheumatism is, obviously, if you're trying to fight, you can't hold a gun. That's bad. I don't know how it kills people. Generally, I guess you'd call this a quote-unquote mistake. Where you're unable to hold on to something and you fall or whatever. Scurvy, right? Lemons, limes, orange juice. Gross. We'll get to some of those side effects later. Night blindness we'll come back to. Nostalgia. And, nostalgia is really kind of silly. Make fun of, easy, right? But it's a kind of, nowadays we would lump it, along with probably most forms of insanity, quote-unquote insanity, under PTSD, right? But you got to put yourself in the position of being a U.S. soldier. Let's say you're from somewhere far off, like Ohio, which was back then the kind of edge of the empire. And you were trekked hundreds of miles down the river, then forced to march across to, say, let's say Georgia. When you get there, everyone around you is trying to kill you, right? There's no safe passage. There's possibly gunners in every hillside, every tree. And though you're allowed to write home, correspondence sometimes takes a very long time. So you can imagine these men one day just snapping. And yes, 74 cases. But, we have stories of people freaking out and run screaming out of ranks, out of trenches, and directly into open fire, or being afraid that they'd give themselves away, their own men putting them down. Army itch didn't kill anyone, but it's a form of athlete's foot or jock itch so bad that it can cause flesh to fall off. Ew. Varicose veins, question mark. Headache, most likely an aneurysm. I killed that one guy. Colic, which you'd think was something that only babies could get, and frankly, they've changed the diagnosis now for most of them. And then, of course, ironically, constipation killed 23 when 17 million cases of diarrhea affected the other side of the country. Now, as far as the war goes, right, when we're talking about this kind of thing, this means, right, that there's over 21 million illnesses that make it so people are too sick to fight, which means that it killed 42,500, right? That means of the roughly 2.1 million troops that fought in the Union Army, they were sick 10 times while in service. And though those numbers fluctuate, you know, it kind of keeps this into context. Also, it allows the Union Army to discharge about 250,000 soldiers. And in an army, when they're desperately trying to round up more people, if you've lost 140,000 and 250,000 are dismissed out of 2.1 million, that's pretty bad. And so, you know, keep that filed away somewhere. It is kind of worth thinking about, though, a few of these kind of neat, interesting story-like cases, because it puts into context why this kind of a thing is so unusual. So one of the most important, I guess, illnesses, right, that kind of contextualizes this whole issue, right? We may have talked about already this idea of who is in charge of the battlefield, right? Doesn't necessarily mean who's going to win the battle. You know, the stories that we coming to talk about how the war is much more complicated than just a battle plan, right? But also, obviously, if I'm going to tell you these stories, they have to tell us something a little bit about the 19th century, since that's the kind of topic of this class at the beginning. So let's start with measles. Now, hopefully, everyone out there had their MMR vaccine, because it's amazing. And, you know, if anything, you saw on the last slide how many people died from measles, scarlet fever, which is the rubella, that's the R in the MMR. But let's talk a little bit about measles, okay? Think about, I don't even know how many out you even got this anymore, because they have a new vaccine for it, which is fantastic. But chickenpox, right? When I was a kid, I had chickenpox in, I think, first grade. And my younger brother, who was 4 at the time, got it from me, right? It's a horrible viral infection that itches, very uncomfortable. I remember taking baths with oatmeal and covering myself in that kind of pink slime that's, I guess, calamine lotion. Now, if any of you have, say, helped at an elementary school, right, or had a sister, brother, nephew, niece, cousin at like a preschool or day school, right? Little kids are crawling with disease. It's disgusting, right? I am recording right now in the echoey basement because I have a infant upstairs, and, you know, yeah, prepare for illness, right? But I brought that example up, right, because just like the flu or stomach virus sweeps through an elementary school, right, that's where chickenpox comes from, right? It's a childhood gathered immunity. But it's important that you get it as a child, because for those of you who don't know, if you're an adult who gets it, it can be very dangerous. Shingles, which is painful, right? Well, measles, mumps, and rubella were the same way. Yes, children died. But if you got it as a child, it was bad, but often not lethal. Measles as an adult is something completely different. Causes severe nerve damage, often leading to rheumatism. In men, it causes sterility and can lead to death. Okay, so why do you think then it affected the Confederacy more than the Union? Again, waiting for dramatic effect. Think about an answer. Well, the reason is many of the Union troops came from more urban areas. The Confederacy, the South, was much more rural. This means, of course, that in an urban setting, you're around more people. Therefore, in the spring, when the disease is swept through, you were more likely to have gotten it as a kid. Since the Confederacy had to recruit from places often miles and miles and miles away, they were less likely to get these childhood diseases. So it doesn't matter if it was from rural Ohio in the Union or across the Confederacy in the South. You were more likely to get these childhood collective diseases that would have been, say, given you a group immunity earlier, but as an adult caused incredible pain. A couple more short examples here. But nyclopia, nyctalopia. I never say this right, so I'll just say the other name, night blindness. Okay. So when you were a kid, your mom may have told you, or your dad, to eat your carrots because your carrots will give you X-ray vision. Ooh. It's shenanigans, not true. But what it does do, which is quite interesting, is it has beta carotene. Now, beta carotene is vitamin A, and what's interesting about it, okay, it is kind of incredibly important to your eyes. In your eyes, you have rods and cones, as you might remember from, you know, psychology or biology class, right? And the cones in your eye see colors. The rods see black and white / contrast / definition of light, right? Okay. Well, they need a lot of beta carotene. And so stage 1 of scurvy, right? You might have remember scurvy. If you don't eat your oranges or your lemons or your limes, you eat your vitamin C, you can get a horrible condition in which everything fails on you. Your teeth fall out, you go bald, your skin flushes off, and ultimately you die crazy. It's why the British are called limeys. Their navy would actually grow lime trees on the ship to make sure that the punches that they made, which were made often of pure rum and lime, would keep them from getting scurvy. So here, if you have scurvy, but you also don't get enough beta carotene, you literally can't see at night anymore. So the Confederates were so malnourished that by year 3 of the war, there are actually stories of people eating the corn out of the feces of the horses in order to get any sort of vegetables, because they were literally starving. But we start, and this is only discovered about 20 years ago, but we look at the battlefield reports between Confederate and Union troops, right? And the Union would tell these stories about how they were able to fight well into the dusk because the stars were out and the moon was out, and but the Confederates had no idea where the bullets were coming from because they were so malnourished they couldn't see at all in the dark. Dramatic effect. Dramatic effect. Last couple stories I want to just kind of throw at you. Malaria, for example. Now, malaria is one of the scourges that have affected man for one of the longest, right? It's a protozoan illness spread by mosquitoes via kind of blood transfer, excuse me. And it works via kind of the implantation of the protozoan into the bloodstream. It is treated at the time by quinine, which is extracted from the bark of a South American tree, extracted often with alcohol. Extracted by alcohol, usually supported by a sugar solution. Quinine is the primary ingredient in tonic water. It was thought at the time that gin, which had spruce and juniper in it, would help strengthen the quinine, which is where we get the gin and tonic from. But quinine, in fact, was an ingredient in malarial drugs for a very long time until more modern medication could be used. But malaria is a horrible illness. You get extraordinarily high fevers, which could kill you, honestly. And then they go away, and they could come back at any 2 days later, a month later, years later. But you have to take the medication for the rest of your life. At Vicksburg, for those of you who don't know the Civil War very well, Vicksburg is an incredibly important battle. The first commander of Union troops, Winfield Scott, wanted to essentially suffocate